Throughout history, the death of nations has been written in fire and blood. We expect to hear the roar of cannons, the march of boots crushing soil, the screaming descent of artillery shells tearing through the sky. But in the 19th century, the mightiest empire of the Middle East was not destroyed by armies, it was dismantled by accountants. It was conquered not with gunpowder, but with compound interest. This is the story of history's first true debt trap. The story of how the Ottoman Empire, a superpower that had terrorized Europe for centuries, was slowly strangled by the banks of London and Paris. And it's a lesson that screams across time into our modern world, because it reveals a brutal geopolitical reality. You don't need to invade a country to own it. You just need to own its debt. And if you want to understand how the global financial system really works, how nations lose their freedom without a single bullet being fired, then hit that like button right now and subscribe, because what you're about to discover will change the way you see the world forever. The empire invaded Ottoman territory, sparking the Crimean War. This was a conflict on a massive scale, and the Ottomans could not afford to fight it alone. Britain and France, terrified of Russian expansion toward the warm waters of the Mediterranean, stepped in to help the Turks. They sent armies, they sent fleets to the Black Sea, but more importantly, they sent bankers. The war was bleeding the Ottoman treasury of millions of gold liras that it simply did not have. Soldiers needed to be paid, cannons needed to be cast, ships needed to be provisioned. Sultan Abdul-Majid Akul was desperate. His advisors told him there was no other choice. To save the empire, he had to break the ancient taboo. He had to take a loan from the West. In 1854, the Ottoman Empire signed its first foreign loan agreement with a syndicate of British and French bankers. It was presented as a lifeline, as a gesture of solidarity from allies fighting a common enemy. But in reality, it was the first shackle, the first link in a chain that would eventually strangle the empire to death. The terms of the loan were predatory from the very beginning. The bankers knew the Ottomans were a credit risk. They knew the empire was weak, so they demanded a steep price. The loan was issued at 80% of face value. That meant for every £100 of debt the Sultan signed for, he only received £80 in actual cash. The bankers kept the other 20 as commission and risk premium. But here's the trick. The empire had to pay interest on the full £100, not the 80 they actually received. This was the original sin of Ottoman finance. They were borrowing money at an effective interest rate that was punishingly high, while receiving far less cash than they owed. But the cash that did arrive in Istanbul felt like a miracle. Suddenly, the army could be paid, the cannons could be cast, the crisis was averted. The Russians were eventually defeated, and the Sultan felt a rush of relief and power. He had discovered a magic trick. He realized that with a simple signature on a piece of paper in a bank in London, he could summon floods of gold to his doorstep. To understand how this tragedy unfolded, we need to go back to the Ottoman Empire in the middle of the 19th century. From the outside, it still looked like a titan. It stretched from the Balkans in Europe, across the mountains of Anatolia, down to the holy cities of Mecca and Medina, and across the deserts of North Africa. The Sultan in Istanbul ruled over millions of subjects. He sat on a throne that commanded the crossroads between East and West. But beneath this surface of imperial glory, the foundation was crumbling. The empire was economically dying. While Britain and France were racing through the Industrial Revolution, building steam engines, factories, and railways that connected continents, the Ottoman economy was stuck in a medieval agrarian age. It was a land of peasants and craftsmen trying to compete in a world of machines and mass production. The Sultan's treasuries were chronically empty. The tax system was ancient and inefficient. It relied on corrupt local officials who stole half the revenue before it ever reached the capital. For centuries, the Ottomans had solved their cash problems by debasing their currency or simply confiscating the wealth of rich officials. But in the modern era, these medieval tricks no longer worked. The empire needed capital to survive. It needed money to build a modern army to defend itself against the hungry Russian Empire to the north. It needed to build roads, telegraphs, railways. It needed to look and act like a modern European power. For a long time, the sultans had resisted the temptation to borrow money from the West. There was a deep cultural and religious aversion to usury, to interest, and there was a political fear of becoming dependent on the Christian powers of Europe. But in 1853, the dam broke. The war ended in 1856, but the borrowing did not stop. The Sultan and the Ottoman elite had tasted the forbidden fruit of easy credit, and they became addicted instantly. They looked at the shining capitals of London and Paris with their gas-lit boulevards, their marble opera houses, their grand exhibitions, and they felt a deep sense of inferiority. They wanted Istanbul to look like a modern European capital. They wanted to prove to the world that they were not the sick man of Europe, but a civilized, wealthy, and modern power. So they began to spend. But they did not spend the borrowed money on factories. They did not spend it on irrigation systems or education or things that would generate a return on investment. They spent it on prestige. They spent it on vanity. They spent it on the ultimate symbol of imperial delusion, the Dolmabahce Palace. Sultan Abdul Aziz decided that the old Topkapi Palace, the home of his ancestors for 400 years, was too old-fashioned. It was too Ottoman, too Asian, too medieval. He wanted a palace that rivaled Versailles. He wanted a palace that would make Queen Victoria jealous. So he ordered the construction of a massive palace on the shores of the Bosporus. The Dolmabahce Palace is a building of staggering opulence. It is covered with 14 tons of gold leaf. It contains the largest crystal chandelier in the world, a gift from the British Queen. The staircase is made of baccarat crystal. The carpets are woven from silk. The walls are lined with Italian marble. It is breathtakingly beautiful, but it is also a tombstone, because it was built entirely with borrowed money. While the peasants of Anatolia were scratching out a living from the dry earth using wooden plows, the Sultan was importing crystal from Bohemia and gold from France to decorate a house he could not afford. The cost of the palace was 5 million Ottoman gold liras, which was equivalent to a quarter of the entire yearly tax revenue of the empire. To pay for this, the Sultan went back to the bankers. In 1855, he took another loan, then again in 1858, then again in 1860. Each time, the bankers in London and Paris were happy to lend. They were making a fortune on the commissions and the high interest rates. They knew the empire was struggling, but they assumed that Britain and France would never let the Ottomans fail, because they were geographically too important. The Ottomans controlled the Bosporus, the gateway to the Black Sea. They controlled the eastern Mediterranean. They were a buffer against Russian expansion to the north. This is the concept of moral hazard. The bankers took enormous risks because they believed the governments would bail them out if things went wrong.
By the 1860s, the Ottoman financial situation had turned into a classic Ponzi scheme. The empire was not generating enough tax revenue to pay the interest on the old loans, so it had to take out new loans just to pay the interest on the previous ones. They were digging a hole to fill another hole. The debt payments began to consume the entire budget. In 1860, the empire was spending perhaps 15% of its income on debt service. By 1870, that number had risen to over 50%. Think about the implications of that number. 50 cents of every dollar collected from a fisherman in Greece or a farmer in Syria was leaving the country instantly to pay a bondholder in London. That meant there was no money left for the army, no money for the navy, no money for schools, no money for infrastructure. The state was being hollowed out from the inside. To keep the system going, to bridge the gap between the big European loans, the government turned to a group of local financiers known as the Galata bankers.
These were mostly Greek and Armenian families who lived in the Galata district of Istanbul. They acted as loan sharks to the government. When the treasury ran dry before the next big European loan came in, the Grand Vizier would go to the Galata bankers and borrow money at short-term rates of 18% or 20% or even higher. It was financial suicide. The Sultan at this time was Abdulaziz, who had succeeded his brother. Abdulaziz was a man with a massive ego and a love for military hardware. He didn't just build palaces, he built a navy. He looked at the British Royal Navy and decided he wanted one too. He ordered massive ironclad warships from British shipyards. He bought the latest rifled cannons from Germany. For a brief moment, the Ottoman Navy was the third largest in the world on paper, but it was a fleet that the empire could not afford to fuel or maintain. The ships sat in the Golden Horn, rusting, because there was no coal to fire their boilers. They were floating monuments of debt. The tipping point arrived in 1873. A financial panic started in Vienna and spread across the globe like wildfire. It caused a depression that became known as the Long Depression. Global capital dried up overnight. The European banks, suffering their own liquidity crises, stopped lending. The music stopped. And at the exact same time, nature turned against the Ottomans. A catastrophic drought struck the heartland of Anatolia in 1873 and 1874. The crops failed, the sheep died. The peasants, who were the tax base of the empire, faced starvation. Famine stalked the land. The tax collectors went into the villages demanding payment and found nothing but dust and corpses. The revenue stream collapsed, but the debt payments remained fixed. In the summer of 1875, the Grand Vizier Mahmud Nedim Pasha looked at the ledgers and realized the game was up. The treasury was completely empty. There was a massive payment due to the European bondholders in October, and there was simply no cash to pay it. He tried to float a new loan, but the markets were closed. No one would lend a penny to the sick man of Europe. The empire faced a terrible choice. It could starve its own people to pay the foreign bankers, or it could stop paying. On October 6, 1875, the Ottoman government issued a decree that shook the financial capitals of Europe. It was known as the Decree of Ramazan. In this document, the government announced that it would cut its debt payments in half. It would pay 50% in cash and the other 50% in paper IOUs that promised a 5% return at some point in the future. In the polite language of diplomacy, this was called a moratorium. In the brutal language of finance, it was a default. The Ottoman Empire had gone bankrupt. The reaction in Europe was furious. Millions of middle-class investors in Britain and France had bought Ottoman bonds because they offered high yields. Vicars in England and shopkeepers in Paris saw their savings wiped out overnight. The newspapers screamed that the Turks were thieves and swindlers. The diplomatic support that Britain and France had given the Ottomans against Russia evaporated. This financial weakness immediately invited aggression. Seeing that the Sultan was broke and friendless, the Russian Empire saw an opportunity to finish the job they had started in Crimea. In 1877, Russia declared war. The Russo-Turkish War of 1877 to 1878 was a disaster for the Ottomans. The Ottoman army fought bravely, but they were unpaid, undersupplied, and demoralized. The Russians marched all the way to the suburbs of Istanbul. They could see the minarets of Hagia Sophia from their forward positions. The empire was forced to sign a humiliating peace treaty, ceding vast territories in the Balkans and the Caucasus. But the most devastating clause of the peace treaty was financial. The Russians imposed a massive war indemnity. They demanded that the Ottomans pay them over 800 million francs as punishment for the war. Now the Ottoman Empire was in a truly impossible position. It owed hundreds of millions of pounds to the British and French bankers, which it had already defaulted on, and on top of that, it now owed a massive war debt to the Russian Tsar. The total debt load was now far greater than the entire value of the Ottoman economy. The empire was insolvent. It was defenseless. It had lost its credit, its territory, and its dignity. Sultan Abdul Hamid II, who had ascended the throne during this chaos, sat in his palace knowing that he was the ruler of a corpse. He waited for the European powers to carve up his lands like a Christmas turkey. But the British and the French had a different idea. They didn't want to conquer the Ottoman Empire territorially. That would be messy and expensive. It would require armies and colonial administration. It would require governors and police and all the apparatus of direct rule. They had a much smarter, much more insidious idea. They wanted to conquer it financially. They realized that if they simply annexed the Ottoman economy, they could extract wealth infinitely without the hassle of governing the people. In 1881, the representatives of the Ottoman bondholders came to Istanbul. They were not generals, they were bankers. They carried briefcases, not swords. They wore top hats, not helmets. They sat down with the Ottoman officials and dictated the terms of surrender. But they were not asking for land, they were asking for the cash flow. This negotiation led to the Decree of Muharrem, issued in December 1881. It was the death certificate of Ottoman independence and the birth certificate of the modern debt trap. It established an organization that was unique in the history of imperialism. It was called the Ottoman Public Debt Administration, or the OPDA. This was the mechanism of the soft conquest. The OPDA was not a government agency. It was a private corporation run by a board of directors representing the banks of Britain, France, Germany, Italy, and Austria. It was headquartered in a massive fortress-like building in Istanbul that loomed over the city like a dark monument. It was a physical symbol of who was really in charge. The decree handed over the empire's most valuable sources of revenue directly to this foreign corporation. The Sultan agreed that he could no longer be trusted to collect his own taxes, so the OPDA would do it for him. The taxes on silk were handed over to the OPDA. The taxes on salt were handed over to the OPDA. The taxes on fishing, the taxes on spirits, the taxes on tobacco, the stamp duty on all legal documents, all of these were legally transferred to the control of European bankers. The OPDA built its own bureaucracy. They hired over 5,000 tax collectors. These men wore uniforms, they carried weapons, and they answered not to the Sultan, but to the board of directors in that fortress-like building. They fanned out across the empire, from the mountains of Macedonia to the coasts of Syria. They went into the villages and the markets, and they collected the wealth of the Ottoman people. If a fisherman caught a fish in the Bosphorus, a portion of his profit went to pay a bondholder in London. If a farmer harvested silk cocoons in Bursa, the profit went to a banker in Paris. If a peasant bought a bag of salt to season his soup, the tax went to Berlin. It was a state within a state. It was an empire within an empire. The OPDA was incredibly efficient. Unlike the corrupt Ottoman bureaucracy, the OPDA was run with modern European accounting standards. They were ruthlessly competent. They built warehouses. They improved the salt mines. They distributed disease-free silkworm eggs to farmers to increase silk production. They actually grew the economy, but they grew it for the benefit of the creditors, not the citizens. Between 1881 and 1914, the OPDA collected roughly one-third of the total revenue of the Ottoman Empire. Think about that number. 1 out of every 3 coins generated by the economy was siphoned off and sent abroad to service the debt. The Ottoman government was left with the scraps. They had to run a massive empire, pay an army, maintain a court, defend the borders, with only 2/3 of their own tax base. This meant that the Ottoman state remained perpetually poor. They couldn't invest in education. They couldn't build their own industries. They couldn't modernize their infrastructure. They were trapped in a cycle of permanent underdevelopment because their surplus capital was being extracted by the debt trap. The Sultan became a puppet in his own house. He reigned, but the OPDA ruled. If he wanted to build a school or a road, he had to ask the bankers if there was any money left over after the debt payments, and usually